Dave had been driving for what felt like days. The long stretches of highway seemed to blur into one monotonous, dark void, with only the faint hum of the truck's engine to keep him company. The rhythmic swish of tires against the asphalt was the only sound other than the occasional flicker of the dashboard lights. His eyes were bloodshot, a dull ache in his temples, his body stiff from the constant grip on the steering wheel. He'd passed the point of exhaustion, and the road ahead looked like a never-ending tunnel. But then, in the distance, through the thick fog that had settled over the highway, he saw the flickering neon lights of a gas station. A sigh of relief escaped his lips. It was too late to find a proper rest stop, and he knew he'd never make it without fuel. The station was small, but it was enough, just a simple pit stop. It would have to do. He pulled off the road, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as he steered into the half-empty parking lot. The place seemed desolate, with only a couple of trucks parked at the far pumps. A single, flickering light above the station entrance gave off a pale, sickly glow. Dave wasn't sure if it was the cold or the overwhelming fatigue, but something about the station felt wrong. Shaking it off, he parked his truck next to one of the pumps. The station was quiet, almost eerily so, except for the faint hum of the neon sign buzzing overhead. The air was thick, still, like it was holding its breath. The wind barely stirred the leaves around the lot, and the world outside felt as though it had gone to sleep. Dave's boots scraped against the gravel as he climbed out of the cab, stretching his stiff muscles. He rubbed his eyes, attempting to shake off the fog that seemed to cloud his thoughts. His mind was exhausted, and the creeping sensation of unease gnawed at him, though he couldn't place why. As he approached the pump, his eyes caught something strange. A figure, barely visible in the shadows near the back of the station, stood motionless. Dave blinked, trying to clear his vision. It was hard to tell with the poor lighting, but it looked like a man, or at least something vaguely human-shaped. His heart rate quickened, though his exhaustion tried to push it to the back of his mind. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge Dave's presence. For a moment, Dave considered turning around and leaving, but his tank was nearly empty, and he didn't have time for second-guessing. He glanced around the empty lot again, then took a few steps toward the pump, trying to shake the discomfort that had settled in his chest. Just as his fingers brushed the handle of the pump, the figure stirred. Slowly, almost deliberately, it began to move toward him. Dave's pulse spiked. The figure's footsteps were heavy, deliberate, yet there was something unnatural about them. Too quiet, too rhythmic. Dave stiffened, a primal instinct urging him to turn and flee. But it was too late. The figure was right behind him now, close enough that Dave could hear the faint sound of breath, or something like it, coming from the man. He was too exhausted to fully process what was happening. His mind clouded with a mix of dread and confusion. He turned quickly to face the person, his hand gripping the pump tightly as if it were some sort of protection. What he saw made his blood run cold. The figure, a tall, gaunt man, stood in front of him, his face shrouded in the shadows. His clothes were tattered, the kind that didn't belong on a person, old, ripped, stained in places that Dave dared not examine too closely. But it was the man's eyes that struck him the most. They were wide, vacant, as if staring through him. No emotion, no recognition, just emptiness. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world around them stood still, the eerie quiet stretching on for what felt like an eternity. Dave's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, his body frozen in place. He should have said something, asked if the man needed help, but he couldn't move, couldn't speak. The man didn't break the silence. He didn't reach out or speak either. He just stood there, staring. Dave's chest tightened, the air suddenly growing colder, and it was then he noticed something else. A faint odor in the air, like wet earth and something far worse. A rot that clung to the air, creeping under his skin. His mind screamed at him to leave, to run back to the safety of his truck. But his legs felt like stone. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the man took a single step back into the shadows, fading into the darkness with the same eerie silence. Dave's breath hitched, and his eyes darted around the parking lot. He didn't know what had just happened, but every bone in his body told him that something was terribly wrong. The man had never spoken. He had never moved toward him. He had simply disappeared into the night. Without a second thought, Dave shoved the nozzle into his truck's tank, not even looking at the pump as the gas flowed into the vehicle. His heart pounded in his chest, and his body screamed for him to hurry. He could still feel the man's presence lingering in the air, could still hear the ghostly echo of his footsteps even though the man was long gone. By the time the tank was full, Dave had already turned to go, his hands trembling as he climbed back into the truck. His fingers gripped the wheel, knuckles white, as he pulled out of the parking lot, not looking back. But the unease didn't dissipate. It lingered, settled deep in his bones. And as he drove down the dark road, he swore he saw the same figure standing by the side of the highway, watching him as he sped past. Only this time, the man's eyes were wide open, and the empty void within them seemed to swallow the world around him. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest as the headlights of her car sliced through the thick fog, casting long shadows that stretched across the empty highway. She had been driving for hours, the monotonous drone of the engine lulling her into a trance. The road ahead was long and lonely, the kind of highway that seemed to stretch out into forever, with only the occasional mile marker to reassure her that she was still on track. Her eyes were heavy, but she pressed on, determined to get home for the weekend. Her friends were expecting her, and she couldn't afford to be late. But as the minutes ticked by, the solitude of the open road began to creep into her mind. There was something about the quiet, the emptiness of it all, that was starting to get to her. It wasn't just the loneliness of the night, but a feeling of being watched. A strange, unsettling sensation that gnawed at her from the inside. Every flicker of shadow along the roadside seemed to hide something. Every distant rustle in the trees felt too deliberate. That's when she saw it. A gas station, flickering in the distance like a lighthouse in the fog. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a dim red glow over the cracked pavement and abandoned pumps. A sigh of relief escaped her lips. At last, a place to stop. She had just enough gas to get to this point, and though she had no intention of lingering long, the idea of getting out of the car, stretching her legs, and maybe grabbing a cup of coffee felt like a small slice of comfort in the cold night. She turned off the highway, the tires of her car crunching against the gravel as she rolled into the nearly empty lot. A single streetlight illuminated the pump area, casting long, haunting shadows across the scene. The gas station was small, isolated, just a few pumps, an old convenience store, and a single, tired attendant inside the building. Lisa wasn't sure what had made her feel uneasy about it, but the silence of the place seemed suffocating, like the station had been abandoned for years, despite the flickering lights. The air felt still, heavy, as if the night itself was holding its breath. She parked near one of the pumps, glancing around. There was no one else here. No other cars, no customers inside. And yet, there was something about the stillness that didn't sit right. She tried to shake off the feeling, blaming it on her exhaustion and the late hour. After all, she was just being paranoid. The door to the convenience store creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed erratically, casting an unhealthy glow over the shelves filled with outdated snacks and the stale scent of coffee. The man behind the counter looked up as she entered, a tall, wiry figure with a scruffy beard. His eyes, though, were the strangest part. They were wide, far too wide for anyone's comfort, with a glazed, unfocused look that made Lisa's skin crawl. There was something off about him, something unsettling in the way he didn't acknowledge her arrival. He just stared at her, not moving, as though waiting for her to speak first. Lisa smiled politely, trying to shake the eerie feeling that was creeping up her spine. "Just a coffee, please," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. She didn't want to appear rude, but something about the man's stare made her want to rush through the transaction. He nodded silently and turned to make her coffee. As she waited, Lisa glanced at the newspapers on the counter, trying to keep her mind busy. She was relieved to be inside, but the feeling of being watched hadn't faded. She felt it in the back of her neck, a prickle of awareness that the man behind the counter wasn't just looking at her with disinterest. There was something more to it, something dangerous lurking beneath his gaze. As the coffee machine gurgled, She turned her attention back to the window. The fog outside had thickened, reducing her visibility to almost nothing. The low murmur of the radio from the counter was the only sound in the room, and Lisa found herself glancing at the door every few seconds. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone here. Not in the way the man was present, but in a deeper, more sinister sense. Something was wrong. Something was waiting. When the man finally handed her the coffee, he spoke, his voice low and unervingly calm. "You shouldn't have stopped here," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a cold chill down her spine. "It's not safe. You don't know what's out there in the fog." Lisa's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she couldn't move, her fingers frozen around the warm cup. She tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out flat, forced. "I'm sure it's fine," she said, attempting to sound nonchalant as she backed toward the door. "I'll be on my way soon." The man's expression didn't change. He didn't smile or show any sign of recognition. He simply watched her as she left the store, his eyes following her every movement with that same unsettling intensity. Lisa hurried back to her car, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. She couldn't explain why, but she felt like she was being hunted. The fog seemed to close in tighter as she started the engine and backed out of the parking space. The low hum of the tires against the road felt oddly distant, like the car was moving through a dream. Every shadow at the edge of the lot seemed to twitch, as if something was watching her, following her every move. As she turned back onto the highway, the man's warning echoed in her mind. "You shouldn't have stopped here." But it was more than that. There was something about the way he had said it, the way he had looked at her, that made her skin crawl. Something told her she wasn't the first one to have heard those words. Just as she drove away, Lisa caught a flash of movement in her rearview mirror. A figure, standing at the edge of the gas station, watching her leave. She slammed her foot down on the gas, the engine roaring louder as she pushed the car faster, the world blurring around her. But the image of the figure remained in her mind's eye, its silhouette standing in the fog, too still, too silent. And as she drove further into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far she went, the figure would always be there, just out of reach, waiting. Paul had always been the type of person who found comfort in routine. Working the night shift at the gas station was never glamorous, but it was predictable. The hours stretched on, one after another, a blur of half-empty coffee cups, the flickering light of the old CRT monitor in the corner, and the quiet hum of the security cameras watching every inch of the station. In the middle of the night, it felt like nothing in the world could touch him. Just the endless night, broken only by the occasional car pulling up for gas. But tonight was different. As the clock ticked past midnight, Paul felt a strange unease creeping over him, something he couldn't shake. The station, though always quiet, felt colder than usual. The shadows seemed to stretch longer in the dim light, and the usual hum of the fluorescent lights above felt almost oppressive. The wind howled outside, making the building groan, and the sound of rattling windows was just loud enough to set his nerves on edge. He chalked it up to the stress of the night shift. The longer he stayed awake, the more his mind started to play tricks on him. He looked around the station, searching for something to distract him from the creeping feeling in his chest. The aisles of the convenience store were empty, the shelves lined with stale snacks and soft drinks that nobody seemed to buy. The cash register sat idle, the drawer locked tight, and the constant beep of the store's security system was the only thing that broke the silence. Paul took a sip from his nearly empty coffee cup, grimacing at the bitter taste, and turned his attention back to the security monitor. That's when he saw it. A figure appeared in the far corner of the camera's frame, standing by one of the pumps. At first, Paul thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the dim, flickering lamp above, but the longer he stared, the more certain he became. There was a person out there, standing motionless in the dark. They weren't moving, they were just there. Paul frowned and leaned in closer to the screen. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in a tattered coat that blended into the shadows. But it wasn't the man's clothes or even his stillness that bothered Paul. It was the way he stood, His back was straight, unnaturally so, and his head tilted at an odd angle, as if he was looking directly at the security camera itself. His face, though obscured by the darkness, seemed to hold an unnerving calmness, almost a knowing look, as if he was aware that Paul was watching. Paul rubbed his eyes, blinking several times to clear the fatigue that had begun to set in. It had to be a trick of the light. No one had come to the station for hours, but just as he was about to turn away, the figure moved. It was slow at first, just a slight shift of the shoulders, then a slow step forward. Paul felt his breath catch in his throat. The figure didn't seem to have any urgency in its movement, but it was deliberate, controlled. It moved closer to the pump, then paused again, as if waiting for something or someone. Paul's heart rate began to pick up, his mind running through every rational explanation he could find. Maybe it was just a homeless person, maybe a traveler who had stopped for a rest. But something told him it was more than that. His hand hovered over the security system controls, unsure if he should call the police or just ignore it. After all, it could just be someone who needed help. But the longer he stared at the monitor, the more the hair on the back of his neck stood up. The figure didn't belong here. Something was wrong. The figure took another step, and this time, Paul noticed something that made his blood run cold. There was no sound, no footsteps, no rustle of clothing, just an eerie, unnatural stillness as it moved. The station was completely quiet, and yet the figure's movements seemed to defy the laws of physics, as if it was gliding rather than walking. Suddenly, the figure stopped again, but this time it wasn't facing the pump. It was facing the front door of the station, staring directly at the glass. The unsettling stillness had returned, and the air around Paul grew colder, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. His breath fogged in the air in front of him, despite the fact that the station's heater was running. As if sensing Paul's growing discomfort, the figure took another step toward the door, slow, methodical, its movements now deliberately aimed at him. It was no longer just standing by the pump. It was coming closer. Paul's chest tightened. He could feel his pulse in his throat as he watched the figure through the monitor, feeling trapped, his mind scrambling to find a logical explanation. He stepped away from the monitor, his heart hammering in his chest, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The figure was still there, moving closer, ever closer. His breath quickened, and he was suddenly aware of how incredibly alone he was in the station. No one else was around. The doors were locked, the windows sealed, and yet the figure outside seemed to be able to sense his every movement. It felt like the station itself was holding its breath. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the figure stopped. The eerie stillness returned, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Paul stared at the screen, his eyes wide in disbelief. The figure was gone. No trace, no movement. It was as if the man had never existed at all. But when Paul checked the cameras again, he saw something else. A faint, almost imperceptible shadow moving inside the store. His eyes widened, and his breath caught in his throat. It was too dark to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. Someone or something was standing in the aisle, just beyond the edge of the camera's view. Fear gripped Paul as he turned around to face the empty store, his skin crawling. The silence was suffocating. The air felt thicker, more oppressive than ever before, and he knew deep down that something was wrong. Something wasn't just out there in the dark. It was inside the station, too. Paul's hand trembled as he reached for the phone, ready to call for help, but the words wouldn't come. The figure was back, and this time it was not just a shadow. It was real, standing there, watching him as if it had always been there. Jack had always been the type of person who thought the world was a lot less terrifying than it seemed in horror stories. Sure, he had his share of odd experiences, but nothing that couldn't be chalked up to coincidence or overactive imagination. He'd spent countless hours on the road, driving through the night, refueling at gas stations that all seemed the same, quiet, unremarkable, and empty. To him, a gas station was just a stop along the way to somewhere else. But that was before tonight. It had been a long drive. He'd spent hours on the interstate, and as the night stretched on, The fatigue weighed heavy on him. He was coming up on a small, isolated gas station in the middle of nowhere, a spot he hadn't seen on his map, but which seemed to suddenly appear out of nowhere. The only other car in the lot was a beat-up sedan parked by the far pumps. Jack pulled in, hoping for a quick pit stop. The moment he stepped out of his car, he felt it. An unsettling quiet that hung in the air like a thick fog. The neon lights overhead flickered erratically, casting strange shadows across the empty lot. It wasn't the kind of gas station that made you feel at ease. It was the kind of place you stopped only if you had no choice, the kind of place you wanted to leave as quickly as possible. The smell of gasoline was heavy, mingling with the faint scent of something else. Something musty, like old, stale air that hadn't been disturbed in years. Jack shook his head, trying to push away the strange feeling in his chest. He needed gas, and he wasn't going to let a little unease stop him. He walked toward the pump, glancing around. The gas station was too quiet, too isolated. Not a soul was in sight, except for the attendant who was standing just inside the small building, his face hidden in the dim light. The old man looked up when Jack approached, his eyes meeting Jack's with a vacant, almost unnerving gaze. The man didn't speak, just gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if acknowledging Jack's presence without actually caring to engage. There was something about his eyes, too wide, too empty, that made Jack feel like he wasn't looking at a person at all, but something far older, something that had long since given up on human connection. The attendant's voice, when it finally came, was low and gravelly. "You sure you want to stop here, son?" Jack froze for a split second, his hand still hovering over the pump handle. The question seemed odd, and the tone of the old man's voice made the hairs on the back of Jack's neck stand on end. It wasn't like a warning. It was more like a statement, as though the attendant already knew the answer. "Yeah, I'm good," Jack said, trying to sound casual as he stepped forward to begin fueling his car. "Just need to top off and hit the road." The attendant didn't respond. Instead, he just stood there watching Jack closely. Jack didn't like the way the man's gaze seemed to follow him, and as he pumped the gas, he couldn't help but feel like the old man wasn't really watching him. He was watching something else, something unseen in the dark corners of the parking lot. Jack finished pumping the gas and walked back to the car, but as he reached for the door handle, something made him stop. He turned around slowly, scanning the lot, and that's when he saw it. A faint smear of blood, bright red and unmistakable, was smeared across the restroom door. It was small at first, almost imperceptible, but as his gaze moved across the surface, he saw that it wasn't just a smear. It was a handprint, a deep, dark crimson handprint, as though someone had tried to press against the door, only to be stopped short. Jack's stomach dropped. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes locked onto the handprint, and the rest of the world seemed to blur around him. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think. His mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Why was there blood on the door? And who had been there before him? He glanced over his shoulder at the attendant, who was still standing in the same spot, staring at him with that same vacant expression. Jack felt a jolt of fear run through him. The old man hadn't said anything about the blood. He hadn't acknowledged it at all. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He told himself it was nothing, just a stray animal, maybe, or someone who had hurt themselves. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. There was something wrong here, something deeply wrong. Against his better judgment, Jack approached the restroom. His steps were slow, deliberate, his body moving against his instincts. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the stench of something rotten filled the air, a smell that made his stomach turn. It wasn't just the faint odor of mildew and stagnant water. It was something worse. It was the smell of decay. The restroom was empty, save for the faint red smear of blood on the tiles near the sink. The walls were marked with scratches, deep gouges that didn't belong in a place like this. The air felt thick, suffocating. And as Jack stepped further into the room, his eyes caught something moving in the corner. Something small, something that skittered across the floor in the shadows. He snapped his gaze to it, but whatever it was gone in an instant. Jack's breath hitched. His heart was racing now, each beat pounding in his ears. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of there. But just as he turned to head for the door, he heard it. A faint tapping sound, coming from behind him. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was tapping their fingers against the wall. Jack froze, his body locking in place. The hairs on the back of his neck stood straight. He turned slowly, but the room was empty. There was no one behind him. No one except the fading shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was quiet again. The air was thick with tension, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes you feel like you can't breathe. Jack's mind was spinning. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of there. But just before he could turn to leave, he saw it. In the reflection of the restroom mirror, there was a figure standing behind him. A tall, dark shape, just barely visible in the glass. Jack spun around, but the room was still empty. His pulse raced, his hands trembling as he grabbed the door handle. He flung it open, almost tripping over his own feet in his haste to get out. He rushed back to his car, his heart hammering in his chest. As he started the engine, he stole one last glance back at the station. The attendant was still there, standing motionless, watching him through the glass. Jack slammed the car into drive and sped off into the night, the station fading behind him, but the feeling of being watched never left. Sarah had always been a curious person. Ever since she was a little girl, she had been drawn to places that seemed forgotten by time, old towns, hidden roads, abandoned buildings, anything that held a secret. But tonight, that curiosity felt more like a curse than a gift. She had been driving for hours, the sun long gone, the dark stretch of highway now her only companion. Her assignment was clear: explore the abandoned gas station rumored to be haunted, tucked away in the small, forgotten town of Pine Ridge. It was supposed to be an easy story, nothing more than a quick photo shoot and a couple of interviews with locals about the station's haunted reputation. But as she approached the gas station, she began to regret her decision. The town of Pine Ridge was as desolate as the stories had described. The roads were narrow and winding, lined with old trees whose limbs seemed to sway unnaturally in the wind. Sarah's headlights illuminated the cracked pavement ahead, and as she approached the outskirts of town, the silhouette of the gas station came into view, rising from the darkness like a relic from another time. The station was exactly as the locals had described it: old, dilapidated, and eerie. The pumps were rusted, the neon sign long since broken, and the building itself looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. The paint had peeled away from the walls, and the windows were covered in grime, making it impossible to see inside. The place felt like it had been abandoned by the world itself, left to decay in solitude. As Sarah parked her car and stepped out into the night air, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a musty scent that clung to the skin. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional creak of the station's structure as if it were alive, groaning under the weight of its years of abandonment. Her camera hung from her neck, the lens cold against her chest. She checked her equipment quickly, making sure everything was ready before she made her way toward the station. With each step she took, the unease grew heavier. It was the kind of place where you expected to hear whispers in the dark, where shadows moved just a little too fast, where the silence was too thick to be natural. Sarah pushed open the door to the station, which groaned loudly in protest, the sound reverberating through the empty lot. The inside was just as forgotten as the outside, old shelves lined with dusty cans and broken bottles, the faint scent of mildew in the air. There was an unsettling stillness here, as if the station had been frozen in time, waiting for something or someone. Her footsteps echoed loudly as she moved further inside, the floorboards creaking beneath her. She paused in the middle of the room, surveying her surroundings. Her flashlight beam danced over the shelves, revealing old merchandise covered in layers of dust, forgotten relics of a time long gone. A faded sign behind the counter caught her eye: closed for maintenance, the letters barely visible beneath layers of grime. It was then that she heard it, a faint tapping sound, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere in the back of the station. It sounded like someone was tapping their fingers on the counter. But Sarah knew she was alone. She turned slowly, her heart rate quickening as she scanned the dimly lit room. The sound stopped. Sarah stood frozen, her breath shallow in her chest, the flashlight trembling in her hand. She told herself it was nothing, just the building settling, the wind moving through the cracks. But the sense of being watched was undeniable. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, holding secrets, waiting for her to uncover them. Her fingers tightened around the camera as she took a few steps deeper into the station. Her light flickered across an old, cracked mirror behind the counter. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something in the reflection. A shadow, perhaps. But when she turned, there was nothing there. Just the empty space of the room. The feeling of unease gnawed at her as she moved closer to the back door, which led to the restrooms and storage areas. The door was slightly ajar, the gap wide enough to let a sliver of light spill through. Sarah hesitated, her instincts telling her to leave, to turn around and forget about the story. But she couldn't. She had come this far. She pushed the door open slowly. The back hallway was even darker than the rest of the station, the air thick with the smell of decay and stale air. The walls were lined with old photographs, some yellowed with age, others so faded that they were barely recognizable. She couldn't help but stop and examine them, drawn to the haunting faces staring back at her from the past. But as she scanned the images, a cold chill swept over her, and she felt the unmistakable sensation of eyes on her. She turned, expecting to see someone behind her, but there was nothing there. The tapping started again. It was louder this time, more urgent, and it seemed to be coming from deeper in the building. Sarah's pulse quickened. She didn't want to investigate further, but something, some force beyond her control, urged her forward. She followed the sound down the hallway, past the old storage rooms, her breath quickening as she approached the source. The tapping grew louder, closer. She reached the door at the end of the hallway, a thick wooden door that had clearly not been opened in years. There was a small, rectangular window in the door, and as Sarah leaned closer to peer through it, she caught sight of something moving inside. Her heart stopped in her chest. Through the window, she saw a figure standing in the center of the room, motionless. The figure was tall, draped in a dark cloak, its features hidden in shadow. But what struck Sarah the most was the way the figure was positioned. Its head tilted to the side at an impossible angle, as if it had been broken and reset into place. Before she could react, the figure moved. It didn't walk. It didn't even step forward. It simply glided toward the door with an unnatural, jerky motion. Her breath hitched in her throat, and her heart began to race. She stepped back, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her camera. She needed to leave. She needed to get out of there. But before she could turn and flee, the door creaked open on its own, the sound piercing the silence like a gunshot. Sarah spun around, her pulse hammering in her ears. Standing in the doorway was the figure, its face now illuminated by the dim light from the hallway. But there was nothing human about it. The face was gaunt, pale, stretched too thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into Sarah's soul. It didn't speak, didn't move except for the slow, unnerving rise and fall of its chest. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Sarah stood frozen in the hallway, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The silence returned, but now it was even more oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. She could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on her, and she knew, deep in her gut, that she was not alone. The gas station for years, but tonight felt different. There was an oppressive weight in the air, something that hung just out of reach, like a storm waiting to break. The faint hum of the lights overhead did little to cut through the silence that had settled over the lot. A gust of wind rattled the windows, but it did nothing to stir the air inside the small convenience store. Tom checked the clock again. It was nearing 2 a.m., and he was about ready to close up shop. The night had been unusually quiet. No customers, no passers-by, not even the usual trucks stopping for fuel. He was about to lock the door when he heard the distinct sound of tires on gravel. The low rumble of a car approaching broke the stillness, and Tom's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't unusual for someone to stop for gas at this hour, but the eerie quiet of the night had put him on edge. A car pulled into the lot, the headlights cutting through the mist that had begun to roll in from the nearby woods. It was an old sedan, dark and unmarked, its paint chipped and fading. The car rolled to a stop in front of the pump, and Tom couldn't help but notice how the vehicle seemed out of place. Everything about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong. Tom stepped out from behind the counter, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. The car's engine cut off with a harsh sputter, and the driver's door creaked open. He couldn't see the driver clearly, just a shadowed figure stepping out into the foggy night. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, but he wore a long coat that obscured his features, the collar turned up to shield his face from the cold. The man moved slowly, deliberately, his footsteps muffled by the thickening fog. Tom approached the pump, trying to mask his nerves with a forced smile. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he gave a slight nod and began pumping gas. His movements were mechanical, almost too precise, like he had done this 1,000 times before. Tom stood there for a moment, unsure whether to walk away or wait until the man was done. But something about the situation didn't sit right with him. The air felt too thick, the fog too heavy, as though the world was holding its breath. Tom shifted his weight from one foot to the other, unable to shake the sensation that he was being watched. The man hadn't even looked up from his task, but Tom couldn't escape the feeling that the stranger knew exactly where he was, knew exactly what he was thinking. His eyes darted around the lot nervously. There was no one else here, no other cars, no one to talk to. It felt like he was the only one alive in the whole town. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" Tom asked, his voice tinged with the growing sense of discomfort. The man paused, his hand hovering over the nozzle as if he had heard Tom's question. But for a long moment, he didn't respond. He just stood there, frozen in place, his back to Tom. The fog seemed to thicken around him, swirling and crawling along the ground like it was alive. Tom felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as the silence between them stretched on. Finally, the man spoke, but his voice was low, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. The words sent a cold shiver down Tom's spine. "It's not safe." Tom's heart skipped a beat. He thought he had misheard. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly despite himself. "Everything's fine here. We've got gas, snacks, whatever you need." The man didn't respond. He just finished pumping the gas, then stepped back, his eyes still fixed on the ground, his posture rigid. He didn't even glance in Tom's direction, as though he had no interest in interacting any further. Tom's hand clenched around the counter, his mind racing. He tried to shake off the unease, telling himself that it was nothing, just a random encounter with a strange person. But deep down, he felt the pull of something darker. As the man turned to walk back to his car, Tom noticed something else. The man's shoes didn't make any sound against the gravel. No crunching, no scraping, just dead silence as his feet touched the ground. Tom blinked, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. But before he could process it, the man was already opening the door to his car and climbing inside. The moment the car door shut, a sharp gust of wind swept through the lot, causing the lights above to flicker. Tom squinted, watching the man as he sat in the car, staring straight ahead through the windshield. The fog, which had been thickening for the past few minutes, now seemed to swirl around the sedan like a living thing. Tom could barely see the figure inside the car, but he knew the man was still there, still watching him. Tom's stomach turned. He knew he should leave, close the station, lock up, and get out of there as quickly as possible. But something held him in place. It was like the man had cast a spell over the lot, trapping him in the eerie stillness. The sedan sat there for what felt like an eternity, and just when Tom thought he might lose his mind, the car's engine roared to life. The headlights blazed on, casting long shadows across the station lot, and the car began to reverse, slowly at first, and then suddenly it shot forward, speeding out of the lot with a screech of tires. Tom stood frozen, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He watched the sedan disappear into the mist, the fog swallowing it whole. The air felt thin, like he had been holding his breath the entire time. As he turned to walk back into the station, something caught his eye, a shadow darting across the far side of the lot. Tom froze, his blood running cold. There, at the edge of the station, just beyond the pumps, stood another figure. This time, there was no mistaking it. The figure was tall, dressed in the same long coat, and it was staring directly at him. Tom's pulse quickened as he rushed inside, locking the door behind him. He glanced nervously at the security cameras, but there was no sign of the man, no trace of the car. It was as though they had never been there at all. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, but deep down, he knew that something had changed. Something about tonight had broken the fragile illusion of normalcy that had always surrounded the station. Tom couldn't shake the feeling that the man, whoever he was, had been trying to tell him something he wasn't ready to understand. Anna had always thought she could handle anything. Nothing ever scared her. She'd spent years working late-night shifts in quiet, isolated places, and she'd become accustomed to the strange sounds, the whispers of the wind, and the occasional flicker of lights. But tonight, as she pulled into the gas station on the outskirts of town, she realized that there was something she couldn't prepare for, something far darker than the usual oddities of the night. The station looked abandoned, with its cracked pavement and broken neon lights that flickered sporadically, casting an eerie red glow across the deserted lot. Anna had driven for miles through the empty highway, and this was the only gas station in sight. She'd hoped to make it through the night without stopping, but her car was running low on fuel, and the night was getting colder by the minute. She had no choice but to pull in. The silence of the station hit her immediately, as if the place itself had been waiting for her arrival. The wind howled through the trees, making the air feel even colder, but it was the complete absence of sound inside the station that unsettled her most. Not a single hum of electricity, not a single voice. The place felt dead. Anna parked near the pump, her headlights cutting through the darkness as she grabbed her wallet and stepped out of the car. The door creaked loudly behind her, the kind of sound that echoed in the emptiness, making her feel more isolated than she already was. As she walked toward the pump, she noticed how every detail of the station seemed to decay before her eyes. The peeling paint, the rust on the pumps, and the broken windows that seemed to watch her with cold, unblinking eyes. Her boots crunched against the gravel as she walked to the pump, her breath visible in the chilly night air. She wasn't sure why she felt the way she did. This wasn't her first late-night stop at a gas station. Yet tonight, every step felt like she was entering a place that was no longer part of this world, like she was stepping into a forgotten realm where time stood still. As she began filling her tank, she glanced around nervously, her eyes flicking to the windows of the station. The air around her felt thick, stifling, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. There was no one around, of course, but the sensation was undeniable. Every movement she made seemed to echo in the silence, like the world was holding its breath. She finished filling the tank quickly and started to walk back to her car, but something made her pause. A faint sound, like a low whisper, echoed through the air, almost too soft to catch at first. She stopped, her heart pounding in her chest, and turned her head slowly, trying to locate the source. There, just inside the store, she saw a shadow move. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the corner of her eye, but it was enough to make her freeze in place. She stood there for a moment, staring into the darkness of the store, but the shadow had already disappeared. Anna felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Her instincts told her to run, to get back in the car and leave, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The whispering grew louder, but it was still too quiet to understand, too far away to pinpoint. "Hello?" she called out, her voice breaking the silence. There was no response. She swallowed hard, her pulse racing. Something wasn't right here. This wasn't just an abandoned gas station. It was something else, something that felt alive in a way she couldn't explain. She didn't want to admit it, but she was scared. This wasn't just about the eerie isolation of the place. It was the sense that something was wrong in a deeper, more sinister way. As she moved toward the door of the store, she noticed that the bell above the door was missing. It was odd. It had always been there. A tiny, familiar thing that jingled when anyone entered. But tonight, the door hung open with an unnatural stillness, as if it had been left that way on purpose, as though it were waiting for someone to walk in. Taking a deep breath, Anna stepped inside. The air inside the station was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and old paper. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. The shelves were covered in dust, and the counters were cluttered with old magazines and broken items. But it wasn't the disarray that unsettled her. It was the absence of life. There were no sounds, no movement, just the silence and the faint hum of the overhead lights. As Anna made her way deeper into the store, her eyes were drawn to a small, faded photograph on the counter. It was an old black and white picture of the station, taken decades ago, with a group of people gathered in front. The image was blurred and damaged, but the faces of the people were still visible. There were 4 of them, 2 men, a woman, and a child. All of them looked eerily calm, almost too calm, as if they were posing for something more than a simple photograph. She stared at the photo for a moment longer, her gut tightening. She couldn't shake the feeling that something about the faces in the picture looked off. The eyes were too dark, too hollow. The child's smile seemed frozen, unnatural. It was as though the photograph had captured a moment that wasn't meant to be seen, a moment that had been sealed away for a reason. A sudden crash from the back of the store made her jump, her heart leaping in her chest. She spun around, her breath caught in her throat. The store was silent again, but now there was an unmistakable sense of movement from the back hallway. She moved quickly, her footsteps echoing on the tile floor as she approached the source of the noise. The hallway at the back of the store was dark, and Anna's flashlight flickered as she reached the door. The smell of something metallic hung heavy in the air. She pushed open the door with trembling hands, only to be met with complete darkness. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway, shrouded in shadow. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, and its face was hidden beneath a hood. Anna's stomach lurched as she took a step back, but the figure moved toward her, gliding across the floor like it was floating. The silence was broken by a low, rasping breath, and Anna could feel the cold air growing heavier around her. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body wouldn't obey. It was as though the figure's presence had paralyzed her, locking her in place. The coldness wrapped around her like an invisible hand, and she knew, deep down, that she wasn't alone anymore. Something was in the store with her, something that didn't belong. The figure reached out its hand, its long fingers stretched toward her, and the darkness seemed to close in around her. Liam had never believed in the supernatural. He considered himself a skeptic, someone who needed hard evidence before believing in anything beyond the ordinary. He had worked the late-night shift at the gas station for a year, and in that time, he had heard all kinds of stories about strange happenings. Sightings of ghostly figures, strange noises, and inexplicable events. But to him, they were just stories, nothing more. Until tonight. It was a quiet night, just like any other, with only the distant hum of the highway as a background to the emptiness of the station. Liam had just finished cleaning the counter and was about to close for the night when he heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching on gravel. He looked out the window, expecting to see a regular customer or a passing traveler, but what he saw made his stomach twist. A car was slowly making its way down the driveway, but it wasn't any normal car. It was an old, beat-up sedan, covered in layers of grime and rust. The headlights cut through the fog, casting an eerie glow across the lot. But it was the car's movement that caught Liam's attention. It was moving at a crawl, almost as if the driver was unsure of where to go or what to do next. Liam watched as the car came to a slow stop in front of the pump, and the engine cut off with a sputter. He saw a figure inside, but it was hard to make out any details in the dim light. The windows were rolled up, and the figure was slumped in the driver's seat, as though they were asleep or unconscious. A chill ran down Liam's spine, and he instinctively checked the locks on the door. For a moment, he debated whether or not to approach. But curiosity won out. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside into the cold, foggy night, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked toward the car. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and old gasoline, and the silence of the night seemed to press in on him. His flashlight beam swept over the car, revealing the layers of dirt and decay that clung to its surface. When he reached the car, Liam knocked lightly on the window. There was no response. He knocked again, a little harder this time, but still, there was nothing. He leaned closer to the window, squinting to try to see the driver's face. The figure didn't move. Liam's hand hovered over the door handle. Something felt wrong, like a warning he couldn't quite place. But he wasn't about to just leave the person there. He opened the door slowly, the old hinges creaking in protest. "Hey, are you all right?" Liam called out, his voice shaking slightly as he peered into the car. The figure inside was still unmoving, and for a moment, Liam thought they might be dead. His heart raced, but he forced himself to step closer, his eyes locked on the figure. Just as he reached out to check the driver's pulse, the figure stirred. A groan, low and guttural, echoed from the back of the car. Liam froze, his hand still hovering near the figure. The groan was followed by a slow, deliberate movement. The figure's head lifted slightly, its eyes opening to reveal empty, hollow sockets where eyes should have been. Liam's breath caught in his throat, and his body froze in terror. He stepped back instinctively, but the figure's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with an inhuman strength. The grip was cold, lifeless, and it sent a shock of ice through his veins. The figure's mouth opened, but no words came out. Only a low, guttural rasp, like something trying to speak through a veil of death. "Let go!" Liam shouted, trying to yank his wrist free. But the figure's grip tightened, pulling him closer. The coldness of its touch seeped through his jacket, and he could feel his heart pounding against his chest. Panic rose in his throat as he struggled to break free. Finally, with a burst of adrenaline, Liam wrenched his arm free, stumbling backward. The figure slumped back into the seat, its head lolling to the side as if it had never moved at all. Liam's pulse hammered in his ears as he took several steps back, his mind racing. The figure in the car was no longer a person, it was something else, something wrong. He turned to run back to the station, but the air around him felt thick, suffocating, as though the fog itself was closing in. The lights above the gas pumps flickered, casting long, stretching shadows across the lot. For a moment, the entire world seemed to tilt, the ground beneath his feet shifting as if the reality itself was warping. Liam's heart raced as he bolted back toward the station, his legs burning with the effort. He could hear the sound of footsteps behind him, slow and dragging, but when he glanced over his shoulder, there was nothing there. The car was still parked in front of the pump, the driver's seat empty, the door hanging open as though the figure had never been there. He reached the door of the station and slammed it shut, locking it behind him. His breath was coming in sharp gasps as he backed away from the door, his back pressed against the counter. The station was silent again, but the feeling of unease hadn't left him. He could still hear the rasping breath of the figure in the car, still feel its cold grip on his wrist. The shadow of its touch lingered, a mark on his soul that he knew would never go away. The night seemed to stretch on forever, but no one came. No one else stopped at the station. Liam stared out the window into the foggy lot, but there was no sign of the car, no trace of the figure. Everything was still, too still. And yet, deep down, he could feel the presence of something just beyond the walls of the station. Something watching, waiting for him to step outside. He never did. Ethan had never liked working the graveyard shift. It wasn't the long hours or the monotony that bothered him. It was the feeling of isolation that came with being stuck at a gas station on the outskirts of town. The empty stretches of highway, the silence, the darkened roads that seemed to lead to nowhere. The kind of stillness that gnawed at your nerves, especially as the clock ticked toward the early hours of the morning. It was one of those nights when the air felt too thick, too oppressive. The station had been quiet, almost unnervingly so, and Ethan was beginning to feel the weight of the silence in his bones. He checked the clock again. 2:45 a.m. He had just finished wiping down the counter for the fourth time that night, his thoughts drifting as he stared at the old, cracked television hanging from the corner of the station. The screen was fuzzy, the volume turned down so low that it was barely audible. That's when the phone rang. The sudden sound made him jump, his heart skipping a beat. It was a landline, one of the few things left in the station that hadn't been replaced with more modern technology. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering over the receiver, unsure if he should pick it up. It was rare for anyone to call the station at this hour, and even rarer for it to be a customer. Most of the time, it was either the boss checking in or a wrong number. With a sigh, Ethan grabbed the phone. "Gas station, what can I do for you?" There was silence on the other end of the line. No breathing, no voice, just static, low and crackling, filling the empty space between them. "Hello," Ethan said again, his voice rising with a hint of irritation. But there was no response, only the unsettling crackle of static. He was about to hang up when a voice finally broke through the static. It was low, hoarse, and seemed to come from somewhere deep, like it had been dragged through a long, dark tunnel. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan froze, the words sending a chill down his spine. His blood ran cold. "What? Who is this?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though it was hard to ignore the trembling in his hands. The voice came again, closer this time, as though the speaker was right there on the other end of the phone. "You shouldn't be here. It's too late." Ethan's pulse quickened. This wasn't a prank call. He could feel it in his gut. There was something about the voice that made his skin crawl, something off about it that made him want to tear the receiver from his ear and run out of the station. "Who are you?" Ethan demanded, his throat dry. "What do you want?" The voice didn't answer right away. Instead, there was a sound of rustling, like someone dragging their feet across the floor, and then a long, drawn-out breath. "Turn around," the voice whispered, barely audible. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He knew immediately what that meant. He slowly turned his head toward the small window behind him, the one that looked out over the pumps and the empty lot. The station was dark outside, only the faint glow of the neon sign casting a sickly red light across the pavement. But it was enough to see that the lot was completely empty. Riley had always been a night owl. It wasn't that she liked the dark. It was more that she found comfort in the solitude, in the stillness that only the night could bring. Working the overnight shift at a small gas station on the edge of town wasn't ideal, but it was the only job she could find, and she had learned to make do with the long, lonely hours. Still, there were moments when the isolation pressed down on her like a physical weight, moments when the silence was so deep it felt like it was swallowing her whole. Tonight was one of those nights. The station had been eerily quiet, with no cars in sight for miles. Riley sat at the counter, staring out the front window into the thick, almost impenetrable fog that had rolled in from the nearby woods. It was the kind of fog that seemed to carry a sense of dread with it, a feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting to strike. Her fingers tapped nervously on the counter, and she tried to shake off the creeping sense of unease that had settled in her chest. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching out into an eternity. 3:15 a.m. Riley had almost convinced herself that the fog was just playing tricks on her eyes when she saw the headlights appear in the distance. A car, its lights cutting through the murk like a knife. She stood up from her seat, relieved at the prospect of something breaking the monotony of the night. But as the car drew closer, she felt a familiar knot of tension form in her stomach. The car was old, beat up, its paint chipped and faded from years of neglect. It was moving too slowly, almost like it was hesitant to approach. Riley couldn't quite place it, but something about the car felt wrong. The closer it came, the heavier the feeling in her chest grew. As the vehicle pulled into the lot, its engine sputtering and coughing, Riley felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just any late-night stop. The car came to a stop in front of the pump, and for a moment, Riley just stood there, watching as the driver's side door opened. The figure that emerged from the car was tall, their silhouette cloaked in darkness, but as they stepped forward, Riley could see that they were wearing a long coat, their face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The figure moved with unnerving precision, each step deliberate, their posture rigid. Riley swallowed hard, her throat dry. She tried to push the strange feeling in her chest away, but it lingered, like a heavy weight pressing down on her. The figure didn't look up as they approached the pump, and for a moment, Riley thought they hadn't noticed her standing by the door. She felt a momentary sense of relief, until the figure paused, their head tilting slightly, as though sensing her presence despite not looking in her direction. "Can I help you?" Riley called out, her voice shaky but determined. The figure didn't respond at first. They simply stood there, their back to her, as if contemplating something. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until finally, the figure turned around. But when they looked at her, their eyes were hidden beneath the shadow of their hat. Riley couldn't make out any details, only the eerie sense that the figure was somehow wrong. Without a word, the figure began pumping gas into the car, their movements slow and methodical, as though they had done this countless times before. Riley watched, unable to look away. Something about the situation felt off. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to lock the door, to get as far away from this person as possible. But she couldn't move. She felt rooted to the spot, her feet heavy, as if an invisible force were holding her in place. The engine of the car sputtered, backfiring loudly, and Riley flinched, her heart skipping a beat. The figure didn't react, didn't even flinch. They just continued pumping gas, their movements unnervingly smooth, as though they were in a trance. Riley felt a bead of sweat trickle down her back despite the chill in the air. She glanced nervously at the clock again, the seconds stretching into minutes. The figure was still at the pump, still pumping gas, still not saying a word. It was nearly 4 a.m. when Maya felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The gas station she worked at had always been quiet, but tonight felt different. The usual solitude that she'd grown accustomed to had been replaced with an oppressive sense of dread that hung in the air. The fog outside, thick and unnatural, had rolled in with an intensity that made it seem like the world had faded into a gray blur. The silence in the station was deafening, broken only by the occasional hum of the fluorescent lights above her head. Maya glanced out the window and into the parking lot. The mist seemed to be alive, swirling around the pumps, clinging to the edges of the building like a living thing. It was the kind of fog that seemed to swallow everything in its path, distorting shapes and sounds. But despite the eerie quiet, the night had been uneventful until now. Maya had only one customer earlier, a man who paid quickly and left without a word. The isolation had made the minutes feel like hours. But then, she heard it. A low, guttural sound, barely audible over the distant hum of the highway. It was a scraping noise, like something or someone dragging across the pavement. Maya froze, her heart skipping a beat. The sound came again, this time louder, and she could feel the vibration of it through the floorboards beneath her feet. Her instincts screamed at her to lock the door, to hide, to do anything but stay in the open. But she couldn't move. Something about the noise paralyzed her. Her eyes darted toward the security monitors, but the screens were static, the usual feed from the cameras flickering as if something was interfering with them. The night had gone from eerily still to unsettlingly active in an instant. Maya's pulse quickened as she stood there, glued to the spot, trying to make sense of the sound that now echoed from outside. It was coming from the back of the station. She could see the faint outline of the service area through the fog, but the visibility was so poor that she could barely make out anything beyond the first few feet. Her breath came out in shallow bursts as she debated whether to go outside and check or call for help. But who would she call? She was alone, miles away from the nearest town. The phone lines were often unreliable at this time of night, and the cell service was spotty. She took a cautious step toward the back door, the chill in the air making her breath catch in her throat. The noise came again, louder this time, followed by a soft, rasping whisper that made the blood in her veins run cold. "Help me?" The voice croaked, barely audible. Maya stopped dead in her tracks, her heart hammering in her chest. The voice didn't belong to anyone she knew, and it wasn't the sound of any animal or wind. It was too human, too desperate. Without thinking, she grabbed the nearest flashlight and rushed toward the door. Her mind raced, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the lock. There was no one there, no car in sight, no sign of any movement. The lot was completely empty, save for the thick fog that now surrounded the station like an impenetrable wall. She stepped outside, the cold air biting at her skin. The scraping noise came again, closer now, right behind the building. Her flashlight flickered in the mist, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the corner of her vision. Maya swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the silence press against her. The sound of dragging grew louder, more pronounced, until it was directly behind her. Maya spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the fog in a frantic sweep. But there was nothing. The lot was completely deserted. Her mind raced, but there was no time for logic, no time for questions. The scraping noise came again, this time louder, almost deafening, followed by the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Maya's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively stepped back. But before she could react, a shadow appeared from the fog. It was tall, too tall, its form vague and distorted by the mist. The figure moved toward her with an eerie, deliberate pace, its movements slow, almost gliding across the ground.